discovered is that it would lower levels of depression in people who would have their vagus nerve stimulated in this way. And you might be thinking, wonderful. Can I have one of these implanted in me? And the answer is probably not, no. But are there things that we can do that don't take expensive, invasive surgical procedures to lower levels of depression and make people happier? I was just in the Netherlands before this, and in the Netherlands, more than 50% of young people are struggling with a psychological disorder. You think about it. One of the richest countries in the world, people have success, they have everything they need, and the majority of them are struggling with a psychological disorder. In the United States, it's close to that, and we'll look at that later. But are there things we can do to reverse this that don't cause a great outlay of means or don't cost a lot of money? Well, talking about this vagus nerve, it is reported in the journal Frontiers in Human Neuroscience in an article entitled Breath of Life. That slow breathing technique, specifically where you have slow exhalation, stimulate the vagus nerve and help people feel more relaxed. You see, when you become stressed or when you're anxious, what happens is your breathing rate becomes more rapid. You start, when you're stressed, you may not notice it, but it becomes more rapid and it becomes more shallow also. Well, we can actually lower the levels of stress hormones in the body by slowing down the breathing rates, and breathing deeper breaths can actually stimulate this vagus nerve. So you don't have to have a surgery. You could learn to breathe the way you were designed to breathe, and you could lower levels of stress and anxiety. And I call this breathing accurately. If you look at a baby, and a baby is lying down, and it's breathing, what goes up and down on the baby as they breathe? Well, it turns out it's their tummy, their stomach. Now, as we get older, often we learn to breathe inaccurately. What we do often is maybe we want to suck in our stomach so we don't look like we have a tummy, and then we breathe, which looks like a deep breath because our chest goes out. But in actuality, to breathe accurately, to breathe the way we were designed to breathe, is to breathe into the diaphragm. It looks like it's the upper stomach area. If you've ever taken a choir class, that's exactly what your teacher teaches you to do. They say, listen, if you're going to sing properly, you need to breathe not into the upper chest, but a deep, full inspiration into the diaphragm. And look what the research shows. A systematic review and meta-analysis that's looking at as many studies as they could find was reported in the journal Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, looking at the impact of slow breathing, slowing down your breathing on both the brain and mind. Now, what did they find? They reported that fMRI scans, so they were scanning the brains of people who are slowing down their breathing and having deep breaths, and it reveals that it enhances activity in what's called the prefrontal cortex. That's the front portion of the brain. And that front portion of the brain is where you make your decisions in life. When you're trying to make a decision between good and bad, that is taking place in the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain. And it was also found to bring comfort when people breathed accurately. It brought comfort, it lowered levels of anxiety, depression, and anger. This is really quite amazing. It also helps people to feel more relaxed and yet more alert. So learning to breathe accurately, just doing a deep breath and trying to do it, I'm going to show you very quickly how to learn to feel your diaphragm. If I take this chair and I sit down like this, you can try it, although some of these seats might be, don't hit your head. You put your arms between your legs like this, and simply by putting your arms between your legs, you bend over like this and take a deep breath. do you feel, if you try that, you'll feel like it's pushing into your upper stomach area. That's your diaphragm. So you don't have to bend over all the time. I'm just helping you feel what the diaphragm feels like. And then you want to learn to breathe like that. So not breathe bent over, but breathe into your diaphragm. And if you were to slowly breathe in, counting to maybe 7, like basically, the in-breath would be 7 seconds, and then you breathe out for 7 seconds. You do that 4 or 5 different times, your blood pressure will start to go down, your anxiety will start to go down, and you simply, within minutes, can actually feel somewhat better. Now, that doesn't cure all depression, mind you, but it's something that we can simply do when we feel anxious that can be beneficial. And going along with this, is it possible to blow away GERD? What is GERD? The technical term is gastroesophageal reflux disease. What is that? Typically, we call it heartburn. Have you ever had it where you eat a meal, and after the meal, the stomach acid begins to come up into your throat, and maybe even into your mouth, and you can kind of taste that acidity? Not very pleasant, right? But they've actually found that learning to breathe from your diaphragm can actually lower levels of this, acid coming up into your esophagus. So just learning to breathe properly is very important. There's other things you can do also. Lowering the fat content of your diet can rapidly reverse this problem, but that's a side point. But researchers have done a study where they cut 80% of the vagus nerve in rodents. And what they found was that when they did that, it negatively impacted the memory of these rodents. Now, who would have ever guessed that your intestines may somehow impact your memory through this vagus nerve? This is very fascinating. And so we're going to be looking at things that we can do. For instance, we're going to be talking about bacteria, good bacteria that may make you healthier and happier. And I'm not talking about buying a pill, but how to get the good bacteria that you need naturally to be happier, more social, and potentially even more outgoing. And I used to struggle with, not technically, but it used to stress me out spending time with people. I traveled the world speaking, but spending time with people would actually make me stressed. I could speak up front, but then I wanted to run away. And I had this while I had this gut issue. And when my gut healed, now I can spend all day, every day with people, and it doesn't cause me any stress anymore. I've literally been healed. And so we're going to talk about things you can potentially do, because more people today are struggling with things like social phobia. Especially after COVID, when we were separated for so long, society has been changed. The depression levels have skyrocketed, and we're living in a very different world than we were living in 2019. But we're going to talk about the impact of the bacteria on the brain and things that you can do to become potentially happier. And by the way, even if you don't struggle with some of the things we're talking about, I guarantee you either know somebody or will come in contact with people that do, and so you can take the information that you find in this seminar and you may be able to help people around you. And so these, like I said, not everything is for you, but it may be for someone you come in contact with, and you may be able to be a tool to help out other people around you. I want to talk about the frontal lobe and addiction. This, in our illustration, this blue portion of the brain is what researchers call the frontal lobe. And this is the center of what researchers call executive function. This is the part of the brain that helps you control your behavior. You feel like doing something you know you shouldn't do, and that decision takes place just behind your forehead in the frontal lobe. It also, the frontal lobe helps you control your impulses, focus your attention, and it helps you to plan. But many of you've probably heard in the last few years about the gut-brain connection, but even before you heard the term, you knew that there was a connection between the gut and the brain when it came to something like alcohol. You knew that if you drank alcohol, it could go into the gut, but it could impact your mind. But we're going to find that there's many other things, even food, that can do the same thing to a lesser degree. And this was a study from Harvard on over 3,000 people, and it revealed that even light drinking of alcohol can shrink the frontal lobe, even light drinking. And the shrinkage intensifies as more alcohol is consumed. So you could say, in other words, more alcohol, less brain. And that's a heavy thought. I actually used to be a heavy drinker, and I gave up alcohol because it turns out I like having a brain. Something I appreciate. And here's some research on mechanisms of neurodegeneration, that means breaking down of the brain, and regeneration, that's regrowth of the brain in alcoholism. Scientists have discovered that just 4 days of binge drinking, 4 days of heavy drinking can shrink the brain. It can cause atrophy to the brain. But they also found that staying away from alcohol could regenerate the brain. The brain could actually start growing back if you gave up on the alcohol. The trouble with the study is, it's a study on rodents, mice. So I believe we're going to find out in time that it also works for humans, but the first studies out there are on rodents in particular. But I think we're going to find that God actually made it so not only rodents' brains could grow back after they quit drinking, but also we're going to find the same thing in time in humans. But we're also going to talk about food later this week that can change the composition of bacteria in your gut and make you less prone to addiction, to depression, anxiety, and maybe even OCD, or what's called obsessive compulsive disorder, where you have these negative, you feel like you have to do certain things. Could food actually help reverse this in many cases? We're going to look at that. Now, I'm going to show a video clip from a documentary that my wife and I produced called Ancient Health, and you can listen along.
It's very interesting, in my specialty of diagnostic radiology, we've had the ability to go back 3,500 years in time.
The Egyptian mummies dating back 3,500 years ago have been studied by autopsy, where they cut into the mummy and they look at the various organs and arteries, and also by CT scans.
We can look at CT scans, we can look at MRIs. We can basically, through these imaging devices, begin to understand the diseases of the ancient Egyptians.
The paleopathologists are able to determine what types of diseases they had through x-rays and through different types of tests. Paleopathology is a study of diseases of ancient man.
And they can look inside. And what they're discovering is actually fascinating.
The upper echelon of the Egyptian society suffered from the very same diseases that the upper echelon or middle class and upper class of our Western culture deals with today.
In fact, Ramesses the Great is believed to have died from a heart attack.
Heart disease, very common cause of death. Cancer, very common cause of death. Gallbladder disease was rampant there with gallstones, with the increased cholesterol.
Gallstones are always associated, or most often associated, with very high-fat diet. Again, consistent with the same kind of diet we have in Western nations.
The famous Queen Hatshepsut, her mummy has been identified. And Hatshepsut was probably the most powerful female ruler that ever lived. She actually ruled Egypt as king. She wore the royal headdress with the cobra. She even wore the beard that the pharaohs wore. Hatshepsut is believed to have died from obesity, diabetes, and liver cancer.
And the Egyptians did suffer from diseases that we suffer from today simply because they also had a very similar lifestyle to what we have today.
70% of deaths in North America are due to chronic diseases that are diet and lifestyle induced. Globally, it's about 63% and rising.
On the other hand, just imagine you could reverse many of these diseases by making some simple lifestyle changes. How we eat, how we drink, how we sleep, how we love.
That means 70% of the patients can be treated effectively through lifestyle medicine.
Many of these diseases, especially when it comes to heart disease, coronary disease, is totally avoidable.
We know that if people chose to eat differently and if they chose to live active lives, the risk of these diseases would be reduced probably 90% for diabetes, 80% for heart disease, 70% for cancers, just by changing your diet and lifestyle.
One of the food products and major parts of the diet of the ancient Egyptians was definitely meat products.
That Egyptians thrived, if you will. Maybe thrived is too strong a word, but they enjoyed, at least the wealthy did, their rich foods, their fowl, their meat sources.
Any person of history knows who mummies were. They were the priests, the priestess, the kings, the queens. They're also called pharaohs.
It was these affluent folks that began to develop the atherosclerosis and whatnot that we're seeing today.
They were obese. They had, as I mentioned, artery disease all over the body. They had the diseases of rich people.
Those that had diets of overabundance, maybe, every breakfast, lunch, and dinner was kind of like Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's in terms of the diet, and that was killing them, and it's killing us.
However, it's quite interesting when you look at some of the earlier dynasties in ancient Egypt, and the paleopathologists studied the causes of death in those times. They actually ate more of a plant-based diet. They didn't refine their date sugar. They had more whole food plant foods. And they did not have the level of diseases that the latter dynasties had when they ate all types of animal products and unhealthy food.
So as we look at the Egyptian mummies, we see diseases that are facing us today.
And they're discovering a tremendous amount of information, and we now know that if you choose that lifestyle, it doesn't matter if it was 4,000 years ago, you're going to have the same diseases. The lifestyle predicts the outcome.
There's lessons that we can learn today when you look at the older culture, which ate more of a healthy diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, unrefined foods, unrefined date sugar, whole plant foods. They had better health, and you compared it to the later dynasties of ancient Egypt, where they ate more of a diet, actually more like Western diets today. They had all these types of diseases that we have today, the heart disease, the cancer, diabetes, etc.
Ancient Egyptian mummies, as we study them, are unlocking questions we've had for millennia about health, why people lived, why people died. We know why they were dying, but they answer questions not just about the past, but also that we have in the present. What should we be eating now? And really, if we take that information, they're helping us know what we should eat even in the future.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? To hear about the history of the ancient Egyptians. And what they found is that these Egyptians were, specifically the wealthy Egyptians, were the ones who were mummified. Not, the poor people likely did not have these same diseases. These were diseases of affluence. Did you know that over 2,000 years ago, the Bible said in Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, and said, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his laws or his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that heals you. It's interesting that the Bible says that the Egyptians had various diseases. Now, we didn't know for probably close to actually 3,000 years what those diseases were. This has been something that recently people with radiographic technology have been able to, they used to have to dig into the mummies. Now they can actually just do these special forms of scans, and they can look inside the mummies, and now we know what the diseases of the ancient Egyptians were. And what were these? These were things like heart disease, disease like diabetes or arthritis, obesity, cancer, gallstones, and sexually transmitted diseases. Now, I don't know about you, but these here to me look basically like the main diseases of the Western world, right? And now spreading to the rest of the world, right? As the rest of the world becomes wealthier, they get to join into the wealthy diseases also. This is what we see. And obviously being poor has other diseases that can often go with that, but these are some of the diseases of what we call affluence or wealth. And what's also interesting is that many of these diseases are the diseases that can be often either reversed or eliminated through lifestyle. These things are things like diabetes, type 2, heart disease, certain cancers through lifestyle, arthritis, overweight, gallstones, depression, and anxiety. Most of these diseases can either be avoided or reversed through lifestyle changes, living the way that we were designed to live. But I want to tell you a true story that took place a number of years ago in Europe in a concentration camp. A man by the name of Antonio was thrown into a concentration camp, and while there he was put on a starvation ration diet, meaning he wasn't given very much food like people had in concentration camps. And so he thought, well, what can I do? Then he got the idea, wonder what would happen if I would chew the little bit of food I had a bunch. So he would chew it over and over and over. He began to chew his one bite. He'd take a bite and he'd chew 100 times, 200 times, 300 times. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting chewing your food 300 times, but he began to notice that he had more energy and he was warmer, because when you get thinner, especially in the winter, I mean, anytime, people that are very thin are more prone to being cold. But he noticed he would stay warmer and he had more energy. So he began to share this with other prisoners. And most of the other prisoners thought, you're crazy, Antonio, whatever. And so they didn't pay any attention. But two other men thought, oh, we're probably going to die anyway. Might as well try it. I mean, if he said it works, let's give it a try. And they noticed the same benefits. So what ended up happening was, finally, when this prison was liberated, of the people that came into the prison at the same time as Antonio, it was only he and his two friends who had been alive when they were liberated. Now, this is what we would call an anecdotal story. Could be true, maybe it was in their head, but these kind of stories give us an idea of how we could implement a study to see if this is actually true. And researchers have done an investigation into the amount of chewing. And a study where participants chewed their food either 10, 25, or 40 times. And what they found was that they ate the exact same amount of food, the exact same food. But those who chewed the most received the most nutrition. So depending on how many times you chew, makes an impact on how much nutrition you get from the very same food. So this is important because as it breaks down in your mouth, this begins to prepare it for the digestion in your stomach before it moves on to the intestines. We were told in a book called Healthful Living, the benefit you derive from your food does not depend so much on the quantity eaten as on its thorough digestion, nor the gratification of the taste so much as the amount of food swallowed as on the length of time it remains in the mouth. So the key is to chew your food well. And once again, you say, Chad, how many times? Are you saying 300 times? No. Now, maybe if you're in a concentration camp, maybe you want to try 300 times. Actually, he said he found in the camp 150 was the sweet spot. Now, I wouldn't chew 150 times today. It'll take you all day to chew your food. But like I said, if you're in a concentration camp, something to think about. But still, if you want to get more nutrition out of the same food, the more you chew, the more you get out of it. But I want to share something you've probably never heard of. It's a new discovery in science. It's something called opiorphin. Opiorphin. Opiorphin is an opioid. In the United States, you may have heard a few years ago, we had what they called the opioid crisis. Doctors were prescribing pain medication, and it was killing tons of people. And this is an opioid that actually our body produces and we excrete it when we chew our food. Have you ever noticed when you have a sore throat? So your throat is hurting, and then you have a meal. So you eat a meal, and after the meal, how does your throat feel? Feels better, right? And I always thought, well, maybe it's just kind of like, scratching the throat, and so it feels better or something like that. But it turns out the reason is because our body produces and this pain reliever, this analgesic substance that lowers the pain as we eat our food, we swallow it. And okay, that's an interesting fact, but what's even additionally, even to me, more interesting about this is that this opioorphin is also an antidepressant. Opioorphin is also an antidepressant. So how would we get more of this antidepressant? We would want to, what do people often do when they're depressed? They eat. And the trouble is when we're depressed and we eat, it makes us feel better, but as we gain more and more weight, that actually is something that may make us depressed also. So how could we do this without overeating? One of the things you can do is you can actually just learn to simply chew your food more. It will give you more of the opioorphin. It will actually make you feel fuller without having to eat as much food, and it may actually give this antidepressive impact or lowering levels of depression potentially. When we are in our mother's womb, when a mother is pregnant, the baby is in a mostly sterile environment or a sterile environment where there is no bacteria in there. There are things that can cause bacteria, but in general, it's supposed to be a bacterial-free environment. And the baby is introduced to the bacteria that it needs for its immune function. It's introduced to that as it goes through the birth canal. The mother has bacteria that is specifically designed to initiate or jumpstart the immune system of the baby's body. And thinking about this, it's actually very important to get that good bacteria. And there's trouble, though, if a baby doesn't come through the natural route and instead comes out through a surgery that we call a C-section or a cesarean. Now, then the baby is not introduced to the good bacteria that it would have got through the birth canal. Instead, it's maybe introduced to bacteria from the doctor's gloves or from the hospital, but not from what was designed to give it its immune system. And so what researchers have discovered is that C-section babies have statistically higher rates of disease. This was a study done in the journal Pediatrics, and it was 2 million babies that were studied over the course of 35 years. So this is a massive study. And what they found is that C-section babies have higher rates of things like allergies, asthma, bowel disorders, rheumatism or achy joints, and also leukemia. Well, I was a C-section baby, and I had every one of these things except for leukemia. And I hope not to have that, by the way. But the good thing is, through lifestyle, by God's grace, all of these things have been reversed in my life. Except I'm still a bit allergic to cats. I do have that. But other than that, these problems have gone away. And so looking at this, you may think, wow, what do we do? Because some women have to have C-sections, right? Well, the good news is they've done studies on swabbing. So they will go to the mother at the birth canal, we can call it, and they will swab her, wipe her, and then they can put it all over the baby and help the baby get the bacteria that it should have received going through the birth canal that it did not. Because once again, that bacteria helps initiate the immune system in that child. So, and as my wife and I have traveled around speaking about this, we have heard people come and told us, oh yeah, they did this with us. They swabbed me because I had to do a C-section, and they actually did that at the hospital. So this is something that can be very beneficial, potentially, to the offspring. Well, I want to talk about the gut-brain connection and weight control. We're going to share with you some amazing things, not tonight specifically on this, but in a future night, some amazing things that you may be able to help other people with when it comes to weight control, or even yourself at some point. But when we don't sleep well, it can often cloud your mind, and it can make it more difficult to have a healthy weight. This may happen in part by two different hormones called leptin and ghrelin. And researchers have found that if you sleep 4 hours 2 nights in a row, had an increase in leptin. Now this is a hormone that tells you that you have consumed enough food, that you're full. While simultaneously you have a 28% decrease in ghrelin. This is a hormone that tells you that you are hungry. So basically, the one that tells you you're full goes down, and the one that tells you that you're hungry goes up. So when you don't sleep well, you're hungrier, and you're less full at the time of the meal. So what do you end up doing? You end up often eating more. My wife, one of her friends shared, my wife, she saw her after a while, and she said, "Wow, you've lost weight. What did you do?" And she said, "It's easy." She said, whenever I work the night shift, when she has to work all night in the hospital, she said, if I have to do that for a number of months, I just put on weight. And how do I lose it? I get off the night shift and I go back to sleeping at night. When I do that, the weight just falls away. Because the hormones are actually pushing you to eat more and to not stop when you probably should stop eating. And so a good night's sleep, we're going to find that these health principles that we're talking about, they're all kind of connected. That's why we are a whole being. We are a holistic being. One health principle can be good, but when you implement them all together, that's when you have the greatest benefit to your health. It creates what we call synergy. This is research from Washington State University that reveals that 3 nights of working night shift can significantly alter the gut-brain connection. Now, I recognize some people have to work night shifts, but if you're a person who really struggles with depression or anxiety, it would probably be well to get off, to stop night shift. Some people can make it through without getting depressed, but if you're one of the ones prone to it, personally, I would just avoid it. But I want to talk about posture and the gut. According to Harvard Health Publishing, poor posture can increase rates of acid reflux or heartburn, which takes place when the stomach acid is brought up into the esophagus. So poor posture may also promote slower digestion. So you may notice if you're sitting down and you're kind of hunched over after a meal, you may notice that you're more prone to this heartburn. But then simply sitting up or standing up straight can help that out. We already talked about deep breathing can help, low-fat diet can help, and in this case, proper posture also can be beneficial. And could it also impact your brain to have proper posture? Well, there are several indicators that may diagnose people with depression. One of them you may not know of is slumped posture. People who have a very slumped posture are often depressed. And so that actually can be an indicator in some cases. Now, there's also diseases, obviously, that can cause that. But research in the journal Behavioral Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry took people who were mildly to moderately depressed and divided them into 2 groups. One group would sit with their standard posture, where they may be prone to slouching, and the other with a proper upright posture. And the group that sat upright increased what researchers call positive affect, which basically we could call happiness. This is someone's ability to experience things like happiness, joy, and positive emotions. Those who sat upright were also more talkative and had lower levels of anxiety. And it's interesting, when I suffered with depression, it actually hurt to have proper posture. My back would start hurting, it would actually be painful. But after the depression went away, it doesn't hurt anymore to have proper posture. So sometimes a physiological problem can make it even harder to have good posture. And my physiological problem was my gut issue that I had mentioned. And I'll talk about how that reversed in a future message. Another study from Ohio State University found that an erect posture enhanced an individual's sense of confidence. Well, that's a good thing. And I find this one the best study. I love this one. In one study, researchers tested 3 different methods to try to increase self-discipline or willpower of their subjects. One group was to write down everything that they ate, taking notice of their food. Another group would try to make themselves happy every time they felt down. And the final group would try to correct their posture every time they noticed they were slouching. So every time they notice, oh, okay, I'm going to try to sit better or stand better, and then after a while they're not paying attention. Okay, yeah, okay, I forgot. Well, what happened, fascinatingly, the greatest impact was in the people who had the best posture. The people who corrected their posture every time they noticed they were slouching had an enhanced willpower in areas that seemingly had nothing to do with posture. So if you want better self-control or willpower, seek to have better posture. Now, we were actually told this over 100 years ago in some of these wonderful writings, like a book called Ministry of Healing. You read that posture can actually impact people's morality. And that's what they found in this study, over 100 years later, that having proper posture can help you be better able to overcome in other areas of life. And we are told in Psalms, the Bible actually told us, Psalms 20, verse 7 and 8, some trust in chariots and some in horses. Today we might say some trust in tanks and warplanes. But these were the implements of war back then. But we trust the name of the Lord our God. They are brought down and fallen. We rise up and stand what? We stand upright. And there's something beneficial to having proper posture. Not only can it help you on your levels of happiness, it can help you potentially lower levels of stress, social anxiety. It can make people simply happier. And, it also looks nice when people have proper posture, too. You see, I was with a man in his 80s in the Netherlands. I was putting on a seminar in the Netherlands, and this man in his 80s, he said, he heard this seminar on the gut-brain connection. He said, I do everything you say. And he said, I asked him how old he was. I think he was 81 or 82 or 83. And he had such great posture. He said, I exercise, I do well. I said, how are your joints? He said, they're phenomenal. He said, I feel better than I did when I was 35. That's pretty nice to know, isn't it? He changed his diet to a very healthy diet, and in his 80s, he said he felt like he was 35. It's funny that he used that in the documentary, the video that I showed. We interviewed this man who was an Adventist physician in the United States who was doing heart surgery at the age of 95. And I interviewed him when he was 100, and what he told me was, he said, when I wake up in the morning, I feel the same way I did when I was 35. And I thought, man, who wouldn't want to live to 100 if you felt like you were 35, right? But he did tell me, but I've got to tell you, I get tired later in the day. And he said, I have to take a nap. Well, you know what? If you need to take a nap, nothing wrong with it. But he says, but when I wake up from my nap, I feel great again. And we've met people who changed their diet in their 80s. And their life is totally changed. Their energy just skyrockets. They never imagined. And one man, he was 80 years old. Within 2.5 weeks, he had neuropathy. That is diabetic complication where the nerves feel like they're on fire. Your feet feel like they're being burned with a red-hot iron. He began to implement what we were teaching. He said within 2 days, his disease began to go away. It wasn't gone yet, but within 2.5 weeks, he said it was 99% gone. He went from having pain all the time in his feet to having 99% of it, he said 99.9% gone in 2.5 weeks. But it's part of the cure to wish to be cured. We have to be willing. We have to be open. to maybe try what we're not doing at the moment. But this is a little off the subject, but I think it's important, so I'll add it in. A few years ago, I was reading a book called Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain. In smokers, just 5 minutes of intense exercise can be beneficial to a smoker. Exercise fights the urge to smoke because in addition to smoothly increasing dopamine, it also lowers anxiety, tension, and stress levels. The fact that exercise sharpens thinking comes into play here because one of the withdrawal symptoms of nicotine is impaired focus. So what they found is that people who smoke, if you get them on an exercise program, it massively lowers their desire for tobacco, making it easier to potentially overcome. We're going to talk about more things, dietary things that you can share with people so that they can overcome addictions. Incredible information. And they also found that exercise dramatically lowers symptoms, withdrawal symptoms, in people who are struggling with things like morphine or opioids. Exercise can lower addictive tendencies. And just in general, it lowers cravings for drugs. But we're gonna finish this evening with this. Your brain, on the left, we talked about the frontal lobe, the blue in our illustration, the blue portion of the brain. That's the frontal lobe. That's the decision-making center of the brain. It's been called the citadel of the mind. This is where, when you're, like I said, making a decision between good and bad, that battle is in the frontal lobe. That's the spiritual center of the brain also. And the opposite of that, not the opposite, but I mean, something kind of distinct from that is something called the limbic system. Deep inside, it's not on the side of the brain, deep in the center of your brain, you have something called the limbic system. This has to do more with your emotions. This has to do with your craving for drink, craving for food, your lust. These things are in that deeper region of the brain. People who are controlled by this portion of the brain are more likely to be unhappy in life. When their life is totally directed by cravings for food, for alcohol, for sex, for various things, when they live just upon these things without allowing the frontal lobe to make good decisions, they can be more prone to being unhappy, depressed, homeless, all kinds of troubles, broken homes, relationships troubles, all kinds of difficulties. But Robert Sapolsky, a neurobiologist at Stanford University, has argued that the main job of the modern prefrontal cortex, we'll just call it the frontal lobe, is to bias the brain and therefore you toward doing the harder thing. So the frontal lobe is what helps you do the more difficult thing in life. For instance, it's easier to drop out of school. It's harder to stay in school, and it's your frontal lobe that helps you do the harder thing. But typically, the harder thing is more fulfilling in life. Whether it's maybe starting some work, you start working on things. A friend of mine, he's Amish. Do you know what the Amish are? Have you heard of the Amish? They have the big beards, and they ride horses, they don't drive cars. A friend of mine is Amish. And what they do is they put their cows and their sheep in the barn for the winter. And they go the toilet on the ground, and so they bring in a lot of hay and stubble, and it slowly builds up, and it will get this deep over the course of the winter. So you have a large barn, maybe as big as this room, and it's this deep with manure and straw that's broken down. So it's like kind of like compost by the end of the winter. And so he goes in with his sons, and they start with one shovel at a time, cleaning out an entire barn. Now, you could look at that, and you take 50 shovels full, and you've hardly done anything. And you could just think, why don't we just give it up, right? But the Amish are people that work so hard, they are used to using their frontal lobe. And so they use their frontal lobe, and they don't give up. But sometimes we live in a world where you just feel like giving up, right? And it's the frontal lobe that helps you focus and get the job done and not live by your cravings. Now, once again, the cravings of the limbic system here, they're not necessarily all bad. Is it good to have a craving for thirst? Yes, it is. But your thirst could say, you know, the best tasting thing is, I don't know, Coca-Cola. So you're thirsty, but your frontal lobe says, yeah, but, you know, Coca-Cola is not good for you. Water is good for you. So the limbic system tells you you're thirsty, but the frontal lobe helps you make the decision to put the right thing into your body, right? Someone may have a lust issue, and in a marriage relationship it may be fine, but when somebody, you know, goes around town, they get diseases, they become unhappy, it gives a broken home, and so they're living by the limbic system instead of saying, well, actually, research shows that people who don't sleep around town are actually happier. And so living by the frontal lobe, actually, it may be harder, but it actually makes you happier in the long run, because often the harder thing is the thing that makes you happier. And so what Robert Sapolsky said, the frontal lobe helps you do the harder thing. When it's easier to stay on the couch or the sofa, your prefrontal cortex makes you want to get up and exercise. And when it's easier to put off that project until tomorrow, it's your prefrontal cortex that helps you open the file and make progress anyway. So the frontal lobe is important. When I read about this research, it reminded me of something. Doing the harder thing. It reminded me actually of a text of Scripture in the Bible, thinking of Jesus. I think most human beings can recognize, people of various religions, they recognize that there's something special about the life and the character of Jesus. Right? Muslims look up to Jesus. They recognize the holy life that he lived. Christians look at, even atheists recognize that this man lived a life of kindness and love. But one of the things that we can actually see about his life of kindness and love is that he did the harder thing over and over and over. He went for 40 days without eating. He was tempted at the end of those 40 days, yet he didn't give up and go into his cravings. He stood for something better. He lived in the frontal lobe. He did the harder thing. And how do I get the evidence that he did the harder thing? We see in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Forasmuch then as Christ, as Jesus, has suffered for us in the flesh. Jesus suffered when he was here. It says to arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. You see, Jesus did the harder thing, and the Bible says we should have the same mindset. It says, for he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. So what does this tell us? Jesus did the harder thing. And the Bible actually tells us, Jesus, the Bible says in Matthew chapter 28:18, all power was given unto him in heaven and earth. In Philippians 4, verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Jesus gives us the power that he had while he was here on earth. He gives us that power so that we can live in the frontal lobe, that we can make good and healthy decisions so that we can be happier people. Most of the young people in society, over 50% of Dutch young people, suffering with depression, anxiety, or psychological disorders, the vast majority of them, within 2 weeks, could reverse their mental struggles. The vast majority of them. This is what the research shows, and we're going to talk about things that we can do. Now, some of you may not be depressed, but some of the principles in this seminar, even if you're not depressed, what if you could be 10, 20%, or 30% happier? What if you're already happier? Someone might be saying, Chad, I'm happy enough. I don't want to be any happier. No, probably you say, hey, if I could be 20, 30% happier, why not? That sounds good, right? I wouldn't mind. And so I'm going to share with you principles. And so don't fear like, oh, if I come back, they'll think I'm depressed. You know, many people go through depression. I went through it. I'm actually glad that I went through depression 11 years. It was actually horrible. It was terrible. I still worked, I still traveled the world making documentary films and speaking to people, but I was depressed. But after my life was changed by finding ways to overcome, I'm glad that I went through it, because I never would have been able to see other people's lives changed as a result of it. I've been able to share around the world these principles and see other people's lives changed. And so if you struggle, don't give up. You may not struggle with depression. Many people these days are struggling with intestinal issues. We're going to talk more about that. And we're going to talk about healthy lifestyle principles of reversing diabetes and depression, heart disease, a number of different things. And just to review some of the upcoming things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the gut-brain connection to dementia, to losing memory, to depression, and also to weight loss. And this stuff on weight loss, it's going to be mixed right in with the other information. But this is some of the, you probably never seen anything like it. This is actually absolutely fascinating. Where weight can fall off without even trying, and you don't have to eat any less food. And I know in the United States we have these commercials that tell you kind of lies about, eat all this food and lose weight. I'm not lying. You're going to see the fact when I go through. It's going to make perfect sense how you don't have to actually eat less food. You can be comfortably full and still lose weight, and I'll show that as we go forward. We're going to look at 7 habits that can make you happier, or by not doing them could make you more depressed. And we'll look at a health food that can make you angry, addicted, depressed, and damage your relationships. You say, well, why would you call it a health food? Because everybody calls it a health food, but the research actually shows that it may be causing symptoms of mental health problems. And people are eating more and more and more in countries that never used to eat it, and it's being promoted by health presenters. But we're going to look at the research on how it may be causing some of your depression. But before we go, I'm going to ask that you bow your heads with me for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to study both science and Scripture. Lord, thank you that the principles of health that now cutting-edge scientific discoveries are finding, that these principles are actually found in the Bible. That you laid down the foundations of this millennia ago, thousands of years ago. And we now see them being buttressed or backed up by science. And we realize that the Bible tells us that all of the things you gave us in the Bible were actually for our own benefit. And Lord, I pray that we would maybe reap some of the benefits. Maybe somebody here has struggled with depression, anxiety, or maybe social phobia. Maybe they were like me. Maybe being with people finally just stresses them out and they just want to get away and they want to hide and run off to the woods or get away to their bedroom. But Lord, I pray that people, as a result of some of the principles that they may try this week, would find victory over disease of both body and mind and emotions. We thank you for your love. Bless us as we come back, and I pray that everyone would have a